Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to the Independent Sage briefing. Now, as we've learned more and more about COVID over the last 2.5 years, we know that the pandemic's not over. We know that there are various concerns about the pandemic, long COVID and vaccines and boosters and the like. But we get written to every week by members of the public, and we're going to have an exclusive discussion today answering all of your questions that you've sent in, and thank you very much for doing that. But before we get on to those questions, and we got some fascinating ones today, I'm going to invite Dr. Duncan Robertson. He's going to present all the latest COVID numbers and trends for us today. Over to you, Duncan.
Thank you very much. So in some ways it's good news in terms of prevalence, and admissions are falling. But I think the real story for today is the data in terms of the pressure on the health service, in terms of wait times, but in particular ambulance response times, which have taken a huge hit recent weeks and months. And also, I think, following on from this is the ONS survey that came out yesterday, looking at the number of people who are economically inactive because of long-term sickness. So in terms of infections, all UK constituent countries are falling in terms of prevalence. Remember, this is the ONS survey, so it's a representative sample of people in the UK, but it lags a few weeks. So this is data to the 1st of November, the week to the 1st of November. So 2 to 3 weeks ago, infections were falling. So that is good news. So we've come over the peak of this latest wave. And in terms of who was testing positive at that time, it was mainly or was scaled up according to age. So about 1 in 30, 1 in 33 over 70-year-olds were testing positive, whereas basically 1 in 100, 1 in 120 age 2 to school year 6 people were testing positive. So it was very much the older people who were testing positive at that time. And so this is for the last 4 weeks in each age group, and as you can see, all age groups incidence is falling, which is good news for all age groups. And just looking at it in terms of where we are in school holidays and openings, so even though we have schools open at the moment, there are reductions in the number of infections that are in school age children. So good news. So that's good news. On the other hand, we have data from hospitals that's come out recently. So in terms of admissions, this is good, right? Cases are falling, therefore admissions are falling too. That's good news. In terms of splitting it between over 65s and under 65s, both are falling. Potentially, if you sort of squint at the end of that chart, you may see it's starting to potentially tick up again. So we may be going towards a minimum of admissions, but we can't tell whether it's going to increase until we have the next set of data. And looking at the number of people testing, being treated for COVID and being treated with COVID, both of those are falling. So that's good news. Number of people in mechanically ventilated beds is falling as well. Perhaps not as fast as it was, but we still have a significant number of people who are in hospital and being treated in for COVID. What's not so good and what's bad is waiting times. So this is the number of patients waiting for treatment, and so 7 million of us. So every time we sort of put these charts up, it seems to be increasing. So the backlog, which of course was important part of the previous Health Secretary's remit, perhaps isn't being cleared as fast as we would have liked. So you can look at the number of people waiting longer than 1 year to start non-emergency consultant treatment. So you can see very clearly the impact of the pandemic there at the beginning of 2020. But you can also see the effects at this stage of the pandemic, where that we haven't in any way got back to where we were prior to the pandemic, and 5.7% are waiting longer than 1 year. Looking at the number of people waiting for tests, similarly increasing, and we can see a trend increasing there. And if we look at specific conditions, for example, a number of people waiting more than 2 weeks to see a consultant following an urgent GP referral for cancer, these are increasing really very significantly. You can see the target there is 7%, and we're over 25% are waiting longer than 2 weeks. And this is having effects on the number of people that would go on to have worse conditions. And therefore, this does lead to real degradation in the healthcare of the UK. And you can see also waiting longer than 2 months. So you can see this is also very significant as well. What is something we've been talking about for quite a time, but in no way has been resolved, is ambulance response times. So these are so when you phone for an ambulance, you'll be categorized into one of these categories, C1, which is the most urgent, down to C4, which is the least urgent. And as you can see, if you are categorized as C3 or C4, category 3 or category 4, you're going to be waiting potentially more than 3 or 4 hours for an ambulance to arrive. But what's perhaps even more concerning is if you're categorized as the highest category. So these are the people who have an immediate life-threatening condition, for example, cardiac arrest. So the target there is 7 minutes. And as we can see, the time that is actually for an ambulance to actually get to you, the most urgent calls, is creeping up over 10 minutes for those C1 category calls, as opposed to 7 minutes. You may say, well, that's only 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes are very, very significant for some people who've been classified in this. And it's also not getting better. You can see that trend is increasing. And as for category 2, these are, for example, you may have stroke or chest pain, which may require rapid assessment. The target there, I think, is 19 minutes. As we can see, people are waiting on average over an hour for that ambulance to arrive. So these are still very serious call outs. So this is having a huge effect and isn't getting better. And once you do get to A&E, what are your wait times there? So this is people waiting more than 4 hours from arrival to admission, transfer or discharge. And we can see more than 30% of patients are waiting more than 4 hours. And that is once again getting worse. And if we chart it for 2019, which is this blue dotted line here, and then other more recent years, we can see it's kind of getting worse year on year. So very poor care there within A&E. And if you look, this is number of percent of patients that are waiting more than 4 hours for the decision to admit. You can see that's 30% there. So once again, increasing as well. And I think this is the kind of a slide that puts up how long people are having to wait. So this is the number of percentage of A&E attendances where you have to wait more than 12 hours from a decision to admit to admission. And you see 8.6% of patients had to wait more than 12 hours, which is, not good at all. And finally, just like to talk about how this feeds through into economic inactivity. So this is some data that came out from ONS yesterday, looking at the number of working age people who are inactive due to long-term sickness. And this is increasing to around 500,000 people. So if you sort of compare it to prior to the pandemic, or prior to when the pandemic started, we have around 500,000 people who are not working due to long-term sickness. So, this is a problem that's not just confined to healthcare, it feeds into the economic system as well. So there we are, severe degradation in ambulance response times, increasing pressure on the NHS. And we have to remember at the moment, it's very warm out there, and kind of the worst of winter hasn't really arrived. Good news, though, on decreasing prevalence in admissions, and we can see the effect of people becoming economically inactive. So thank you very much.
Duncan, thank you. That data is both fascinating and appalling. I mean, the figures on NHS performance, presumably due to the pandemic, to staff absences, to staff sickness, to staff burnout, people leaving the service, shortages, underinvestment, is all part of COVID, but part of our response to it. And that economic activity shows the scale of the problem. And so we're not through this pandemic in any shape or form. And also, just one quick comment, when you presented the data, I mean, it looks like everything's damping down, but if we compare the peak in this October with last October, it's actually worse this year. And the big question is what's going to happen between January and April, which is when we had a big spike earlier this year. And that's what is intriguing me. I mean, obviously, if we can get through that with not much of a spike, then we can start to feel confident things are settling down. But anyway, sorry, that's my response. But thank you. The data is compelling and fascinating and politically very important. Right, we're going on to questions. And today we've got 3 people joining us and then a whole number I can read out. And our first questioner is Annie McLean. Annie, welcome. Can I see you? Yeah, you're just joined. Lovely. Welcome, Annie. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Yes, appalling. I feel that everybody needs to wake up. My question is it safe to travel on public transport? How do we know this? And if we think it's unsafe, what can we do? And what can the operators of public transport do? Will they do it? And where do the legalities lie? Because I'm sure there's money involved, so somebody must wake up. That's
great. Well, that's 5 questions in one, but very important, and it's an incredibly important topic. And thank you very much for that. We haven't addressed this for quite some time. Who would like to kick off on that? Is it safe on public transport? Trish, Professor Trish Greenhow from Oxford.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Anne, for that question. It's a really important question. Many people travel to work or to school on public transport, and it's actually often very difficult to get to where you need to go if you're not using public transport. Scientifically, one of the issues with either a train carriage or a bus or that kind of thing is that they're quite small volume. The roof of the tube isn't that much higher than your head, and because the virus is airborne, it sits in the air. If you haven't got a very big volume of air, then that means that there's more virus for people to breathe in. So I think if there's a lot of COVID about, being on a crowded bus or train without ventilation is actually quite dangerous, without a doubt with that. What can you do? Well, you want to make sure that public transport is as well ventilated as possible. So if I was traveling in London, for example, I'd be going on the bus rather than the tube, and I'd want to be by an open window. But of course, one of the most important things you need to do to protect yourself and to protect other people actually is wear a well-fitting respirator type mask. And if you do that, that's going to cut out between 95 and 99% of the viral particles, so long as it fits you. That'll do from me. I'll hand back to the chair.
Yeah, well, thank you. Steve Reicher, we've failed miserably, haven't we, to persuade people. I mean, I travel on London tubes and London Overground all the time, and I'm often the only person in the carriage wearing a mask. And it's just, is there anything we can do to restore that in the absence of political pressure from the top? Because people seem to have forgotten about this.
Well, I'm glad you added that proviso at the end, because I think that the problem is worse. It's not that there's been a failure to persuade people. There hasn't been an attempt to persuade people, or indeed there's been an attempt to persuade people it's not necessary. And all those are encapsulated in the notion of it's now just up to you. It's your personal responsibility. So first of all, I think there is a lot of messaging going on, which effectively tells us it's all over. That we're post-pandemic. Those phrases are regularly used. And if there is no risk, there's no reason for people to do anything at all. So that's the first problem. Second problem is the notion of it's not serious. That if you get it, it's like a common cold and we don't need to worry about it. And again, if you decrease levels of perceived risk, not to make people frightened, but for people to have a realistic appraisal of the situation, again, people aren't going to do anything. And perhaps worst of all is the sense that it's all about you. I mean, one of the things that got us through the pandemic at the beginning was a sense it was about the community and asking people to act in ways that didn't affect the most vulnerable, didn't put them in danger, didn't possibly cause severe illness or even death. And we've completely forgotten about that communal aspect of bringing people together, of asking us to act for each other and recognizing there was something to do. So I think systematically what the government has done is not fail to persuade us, but persuade us not to act. And therefore, I think it is up to us as communities to rebuild that sense of community, to talk about social responsibility, to understand the importance with the ongoing pandemic to act to keep ourselves safe. And if I can just link to last week, we learned last week there were 3.5 million vulnerable people, probably well over 10 million people in families where there is somebody who is vulnerable. And the notion of a freedom to act, which in effect means that they can't go out, they can't go on buses, and they can't go on the underground, seems to me not the sort of society that I hope most of us want to live in.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. They're really important points. Two sub-questions that Annie asked was, one is, how do we know about the performance of public transport and what can the operators do? In my office, we have a carbon dioxide monitor. And I remember coming in last week, actually, and it was all the windows were closed and it was about 1,000. And I think the normal should be about 600, certainly no more than 800. And I just opened a couple of windows and it went all the way down to 500. So that does make a difference. My impression is that overground trains are much better because they're opening into the fresh air every station, whereas tube trains are much less. But have we got does anyone know of any carbon dioxide monitoring data on public transport that would tell us or give us a proxy for how risky it is? Trish?
We did have someone on Independent Sage a few months ago who'd done, actually, I think did more than measure carbon dioxide levels. They were measuring viral levels. But yeah, I think it really depends on, I mean, you say, Anthony, you opened a window and the carbon dioxide levels went down from whatever it was, 800 to 500. Yeah. I mean, opening a window sometimes works, but it doesn't always work because what you've got to do is get the through draft. So yeah, if you're on the bus and you open them opposite, you know, so it kind of goes through from one to the other. But the other thing is, of course, that the carbon dioxide levels don't always tell you that everything's bad or everything's okay. I mean, if they're low, that's great. If they're high, but the space you're in is using a filtration method rather than a ventilation method, the carbon dioxide levels might stay high, but you might still be okay because it's being filtered. But the normal level should be just over 400 if you're out of doors. If you're indoors and it's going above 700 or 800, it's probably time to try and get the windows open or some other way. But the trouble is, as you say, if you're underground, there's nothing you can do about it. So I think masking is really, really important.
Interesting statistic that I learned this week. WHO has put out new figures on the percentage of the population around the world who breathe unsafe air, okay, from particles and all the rest of it. Do you know what that percentage is? Any guesses on the panel? Trish?
I don't know.
Steve?
It's a game. Is there a prize? 87%. No prizes. Okay, in that case, 43%. 43, Trish. The answer is 99%. Oh, blimey.
I always knew the figure was 90%, but they've just updated it. And that children around the world, in virtually every country, everywhere, are well above the safety levels of WHO. And of course, if you go into cities, I mean, when you're in a rural area, things are pretty good, but in cities, it's abysmal. I mean, in Delhi at the moment, the figures are something like 30 to 40 times above the safe limit. And, you know, I remember talking to a surgeon that used to do bronchoscopies, so putting tubes down into teenagers' lungs for investigations. And he said, I always used to see pink lungs, and now all I ever see is black lungs. So, you know, this is a massive issue around the world. And of course, one of the reasons we want to transition from fossil fuels to renewables is exactly that, to have safe air. But coming back to this point, we need the engineers and the architects to really think about how we can do this much more effectively, as well as obviously moving towards zero carbon. Sorry, that was my rant for today. Right. I think we've addressed most of your points, Annie, not necessarily completely to your satisfaction, but thanks very much.
Useful, thank you.
Thanks, Annie. We've got next is Bernard Boyle joining. Bernard. Welcome. You've got the name Ben. Is it Ben or Bernard? You're muted. You're muted at the moment.
There we are. Is that better?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Right. My question is, China is shutting down again. A lot of areas of China are shutting down again. And the variants, Omicron variants, are BF1.7, BA.5.1.7, and XE. Now, what sort of infections? I mean, obviously they've shut down for a reason. So what do you know about these variants?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I'm going to come to Aris in a moment about the variants. Just to say, if we're one of the most lax countries in the world at public health, China's one of the strictest, and their view all throughout this pandemic is to suppress it. We thought they would open up after they vaccinated their population, but the problem that they have is that most of their elderly people, who are the most vulnerable, for various traditional reasons, are not getting vaccinated. So they're having to have campaigns to get that vaccination level up. Otherwise, they could see, you know, millions of deaths. It's hoped, I think, that they're going to loosen up in the coming several months. But there was hope in financial circles just last week. But Xi Jinping, the president, came out with a statement saying, no, they were still going to go for lockdowns, local lockdowns, wherever. But let's come back to your variant question. Is it more about variants? Aris, any thoughts? Professor Sourakis.
So, I mean, a lot of these variants that we're seeing now are, in fact, all descendants of the highly successful Omicron lineage. And the first two that you mentioned are sort of daughters of the BA2 branch of Omicron that's been so successful throughout the world so far. The XE one is a recombinant between some of the more distinct parts of this lineage of Omicrons. Now, what we're seeing now is all these variants cropping up all the way across the world, and they all differ a little bit from the initial Omicron variants, and they differ primarily in the way in which they can overcome previous immunity. And that's what gives them this transmission advantage. So these variants are more successful, but their success is dependent on the immunological landscape in which they find themselves. So the fact that these variants are proving to be very, very tricky for one particular country to control doesn't necessarily translate into the same level of success when that variant is imported somewhere else, especially where the immunological background, both in terms of vaccination, but what variants have been seen before, differs. So although these variants are causing huge problems in China, we are also seeing for at least one of them higher transmissibility in certain European countries, And I think I've seen news reports of at least one, the first of those two having reached England. But whether they will dominate the variant landscape going forwards, or whether another Omicron subvariant is going to pop up and obliterate them, is an open question and remains to be seen. The bigger worry is that there is this constant churn, this constant generation of new Omicron variants that are all gradually, slowly chipping away at the advantage that previous exposure or vaccination has given us.
Thanks, Aris. Just a coda to that. The mortality rate in the UK from the pandemic so far has been 3,200 deaths per million. In China, the currently reported rate is 3.2 deaths per million. So they have 1,000 times fewer deaths per million population than we do. Now, some people will say, well, the Chinese, they're cooking the books. Even if they were cooking the books 50 times, which I don't think they are, it would still be massively lower death rates. So we can criticize them for certain things, obviously, and the way they go about it, but their death rates are quantum lower than that. But Steve Griffin, have you got your nice chart of just to show people how mad genetics is and all this molecular stuff on just how complicated? Are you able to share that?
I can share it very briefly. This is made by someone on Twitter, so credit to them. I can't honestly remember whose it was now, but this just shows the diversity, branching originally from the BA2, the one that hit us in sort of early spring, going this way towards BA5, which we've just had here in the UK. You can see that there's this huge plethora of different daughters of Omicron, as Aris mentioned, but they are all kind of figuring out the solutions in a similar way. A lot of the mutations that we're seeing in them are quite similar, but there are obviously some differences. And what this color coding shows you is some of the monoclonals that have lesser binding as a result of these mutations. And that, of course, is also reflected in our immunological response to that. But I'll stop that there because I can't remember who it was to credit for it. I'm very sorry. But I think it's really important to remember that, as Anthony said, China's got a very good reason for shutting down. They do only do local lockdowns. The people there are very familiar with that. I don't think they're quite as draconian as they once were. They also combine it with mass testing, so they understand what's going on during those lockdowns. They don't have as good a vaccine coverage as we do. And I think that's really important to remember, because it goes on, it sort of relates to how privileged we are in our country and in the Western world in general in terms of vaccine inequity, because we have had tremendous access to these vaccinations, which allows some of these policies, which albeit ignores a lot of vulnerable people. And it just shows us that all this rhetoric about the virus becoming milder is primarily about our immune responses, okay? Because BA2, which did cause damage in the UK and did kill lots of people and did cause lots of hospitalizations, when that hit Hong Kong, which had the same sort of vaccine problems that Anthony mentioned about China, that caused them to go from something like 200 deaths throughout the whole pandemic to well over 9,000 in a matter of weeks, and their morgues were backed up and all the rest of it. So we need to remember how fortunate we are that our immune responses keeps this virus in check. And as Aris said, the worry is that this constant churn will lead us in a direction where that becomes problematic. So I think complacency is a real issue here. And I think Danny's got something to say on that as well.
Danny?
Yeah, I'm certainly not to counter any call to complacency, but let me try my hand at a bit of optimism and see what you think of this. So when we talk about the churn of variants, and the fact that we're in a state, aren't we, where there are millions or perhaps billions of people on the planet culturing trillions of copies of virus, and all of those are fair game for the next mutations to come along, and that seems ongoing, terrifying, and yet. I read a piece in Science a long time ago now, between Alpha and Delta, if you can kind of score the chronology like that, which kind of had an optimistic footnote, which said that, the virus versus humans is an arms race, and any arms race has an end game. And the end game is that the virus can't keep on changing in perpetuity because there's always a fitness cost to those changes, and there's certain bits of structure and sequence that it needs, to bind receptors and do its stuff, and it reaches a point where it's just kind of turning over the same changes over and over again, and the evolutionary adaptations of the human immune system, in the end, really logically ought to be able to win through and keep it at bay. And when I look at the picture that you just showed of all those kind of convergent, crazy changes, there's a little bit of me that hopes and wishes that maybe we're coming to that point, that there aren't many new places for the virus to go in terms of new forms of immune evasion. But let's see. Just trying a bit of optimism for change.
But it's kind of that picture you show is kind of proof of evolution, isn't it? That you get rampant mutations and then natural selection and all the rest of it. It's kind of quite beautiful in a way, despite its horrific impacts. Anyway, thank you. We'll move on to the next. I hope that's answered your question, Ben.
Well, there's a quick supplementary.
Yeah.
The ONS figures are 10 days old. Now, if we get hit again by something really ugly and bad, then we don't know. And we haven't got the public health services in place ready for that. And of course, that causes major problems because obviously more people die.
Yes, surveillance, you're saying, is much weaker than it was. I think that's a very good point. Anyone, any comment on that? Anyone? Steve G?
I think Aris might have a point to raise on that, but yeah,
Aris,
I think
on
that
surveillance. Are we letting our
evolution as well
down?
Yeah, I was just going to add something to add to Professor Altman's point, in the sense that I think it's good to have the possibility of optimism, but in terms of that end point, viruses take a long time to adapt and to optimize themselves to their hosts, and I don't think we can assume that the virus is at the end of its evolutionary journey. That can take a very, very, very long period of time.
Yeah,
thank you. Danny? Oh no, Steve G, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just to supplement what Aris is saying, actually, I think one hope is that it could slow down. Of course, the quickest way to slow it down is to suppress diversity and suppress prevalence. But you can even see this in the endemic coronaviruses that we are more familiar with. There are still changes as they adapt to our immune system over time. And so, of course, the impact of that isn't the same in terms of these massive outbreaks that we see every few months now with Omicron. And of course, Omicron may stop. It may become something else, which, pi or whichever letter's next. But it's certainly the case that the best hope at the moment is to slow it down. And if we can't slow it down in the way that China does, then we see this eternal generation of mutations. And it's actually really important to recognize that the changes that occur in the spike protein are doing so because this protein has incredible plasticity and toleration of these quite profound changes. It might not seem like much, but switching an acidic amino acid to a basic amino acid would completely disrupt the structures of many proteins. This seems to tolerate that. And that's really important because we often hear things about viruses mutating quickly or slowly. Mutation has a certain rate, mutation has a certain randomness to it, but whether those mutations become embedded, as Danny was alluding to, depends on that fitness cost and depends on it accruing those advantages. And that's what we're seeing with this huge diversity at the moment. It's really complicated, but also intriguing to watch in real time.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'm going to move on to Louise Vale, who's got two rather different questions, I see. But I'm going to allow her to ask both because they're both fascinating. Louise, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you very much. Would you like me to ask them both questions at the same time?
Okay, no, let's start. I'll tell you what, let's go with the first one because they're both quite long. Yes. Let's go to the first one and we'll answer that, then we'll come to the second one.
All right, thank you. I have long COVID since the first wave. And I saw Danny Altman being interviewed on a TV program last week where it was a very good discussion about long COVID. And Danny mentioned that he'd been talking to a researcher on the original SARS epidemic, which is now 20 years ago. and had learnt from that researcher that the patient outcomes were not good, and a lot of people had not recovered and not gone back to work. So my question is, you know, what are the prospects for recovery from this? And if they're not good, personally, I'd like to know about it, to organise my life accordingly. And also, there are huge implications for policy, of course, employers and insurance and all those things.
Louise, that's thank you very much. That's I also have had symptoms for now nearly 18 months, much milder than a lot of other people, but still with problems with smell and tingling and fluctuating fatigue. So I'm very sympathetic to this. And Danny doesn't know I'm going to say this because we're not supposed to be promoting each other's products, but Danny has co-authored a fantastic book actually called The Long COVID Handbook. And oh look, Trish has got one. It's all right, we don't get a commission, and I don't think Danny's going to make his fortune from this, but it is a really interesting book. It's written by a journalist who's very interested in this, together with Danny, who is up to speed with all the latest research. And I do recommend people, if they can afford it, to get a copy. So it's, what is it, about 15 quid or something?
Don't know.
I think slightly less. I did actually pay for it, and I have a feeling I paid £12.99, something like that.
Oh, brilliant!
That was Oxfam.
Yep. It was not Oxfam. It was. I'm not going to say.
Anyway, no, that's a very good. I'm going to come to you, Danny, then first.
I'll talk.
How long are we going to be sick for?
Yeah, no, I'll talk briefly, and then I'll hand over to some of the others. So I'll make a few comments, because you know the quote you quoted me on is a very depressing quote, isn't it? And I always use it really carefully and sparingly. So let's sort of start by saying that we all know that if you sit on Indie Sage every week and hear about the ONS data and hear about the long COVID ONS data, the numbers at the moment look somewhere between stable and creeping down, as if we're bringing in new long COVID cases, but at a slightly faster rate. Perhaps some of the long haulers might be getting better. So, you know, nowadays we hover between about 2.3 million down to 2.1 or 2 million. So it's not that the number is growing and growing. It's shrinking very slightly and very slowly, which means that people must be getting better. So that's my good news and my big good news. And you know, I'd like to hear from some of the others on this. And the story that you're quoting me on is my worst news story that, as I said, I use very sparingly, because lots of people kept on asking me how long it'll go on for. So I thought my best chance of crystal ball gazing was to track down some of the clinical teams who'd looked after SARS patients after 2003 to 2004. And after much struggle, I found a chap called John Patkai, who was the consultant who'd led the treatment of the long SARS healthcare workers in University of Toronto. And he wrote, you can look it up, he wrote me an incredibly depressing article that finished with words to the effect of, in summary, none of my patients really got better, none of them really got their lives back, none of them really returned to their full-time jobs. But there's a really big but to that he was looking after very sick patients on intensive care, hospitalized with SARS. And, you know, they weren't typical of those 2.3 or 2.1 million long haulers that we have in Britain at the moment. So you know, some good news and some bad news there. But I'd be interested to hear what people like Helen and Trish think about the kind of more normal people that they see.
Helen, I mean, I've never been to my GP with my symptoms because I kind of think there's not much point. But do you see a lot of long COVID patients, and do you get long haulers coming to see you and asking you for help?
Absolutely, I do. I think there are a lot like you, Anthony, who just don't come because they don't have any faith that there's very much I can do. I think it's quite important that I do see them, actually, because I think it's important to count and to have it, you know, coded in the system so we know how many people have long COVID and what the impacts are. And I also think it's useful for patients to go to long COVID clinics. Some of them will definitely benefit from the therapies there. If there are trials, therapeutic trials for long COVID, the way you're going to get into them is through long COVID clinics. So I would strongly encourage people to see their GP and ask referrals if they're still suffering from symptoms. But I suppose my main feedback at this stage is that I would say the majority of my patients are getting better. And some of them have sought treatments that are not routinely prescribed in the UK, or not prescribed at all in the UK, and have gone abroad for treatments which they found helpful, some of them. But most of them have just got better through their own patience and their own attempts, and and time has done the job. So Louise, I it's very difficult to know what will happen for you, but even though it's taken 18 months or 2 years, I would say the majority of my patients are improving and have improved over time. So I'm optimistic.
Do people say that the symptoms fluctuate?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a kind of, on the whole, it tends to be a relapsing, remitting course, but with a general trend upwards.
Right.
And sometimes there'll be very specific things that make them go down again. So overexertion is one of them, which is really hard. People trying to pace themselves, people trying to not give into it and do a bit more, but then they feel rotten, and so that's difficult. Further infections can sometimes put people back, and immunizations can go either way. Sometimes people and they feel, oh, I'm so much better now, and for a few people they have another booster, and actually they feel it sets them back a bit. So it's actually quite difficult to know what it is that's going to help people on their journey. But mostly I'm optimistic, because mostly the patients I see, and they're not usually patients who were in intensive care or even needed hospital treatment. They were people who were sick at home, very sick at home, some of them, but at home, and they're just taking a very long time to get better. But most of them are.
Thanks, Helen. Quick word from Sheena and then Steve Griffin. Sheena Cruikshank, Professor.
Thanks, Anthony. I wanted to also offer another optimistic note, because back when we were talking about things like SARS, which was more contained than SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 has been, we didn't know so much about these types of conditions. If there's one ray of hope, it's that we are doing so much more research. We have a much deeper understanding of what's happening with conditions like long COVID and other sort of persistent sort of symptoms that people get after virus infection. There are clinical trials happening, testing therapies. They're happening all the time. There's more treatments happening. So I have optimism that with the sort of greater knowledge of immunology, of the kind of the virus itself and the underlying physiology that it's having an impact on, that we are going to be able to even better treat and categorize the patients, because there's almost certainly slightly different things happening in different patients. So I'm quite optimistic. Thanks,
Sheena. Steve?
Yes, I don't mean to not be optimistic here, but what I'm going to do is criticize policy, because as you rightly said, Louise, there are some gaps in policy addressing this, because as we've all just discussed, it doesn't take a major infection or a major clinical course to then result with long COVID. And one area that is very much overlooked is the incidence of long COVID in children. We had the long COVID kids charity people on a few weeks ago describing all of that. And really the lack of mitigation measures in our schools, I find absolutely ridiculous. This thing does happen. There's just been a study published today in PLOS Medicine about a very large study in Germany, which confirms many other studies showing that children can get this terrible condition as well. And of course, the impact on a young life is profound. And I would also say that one of the things that does help us with long COVID is being vaccinated before we are exposed. So there's, I think, every need for us to try and increase those childhood vaccination programs going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's really important. Louise, we'll come to your second question, but just quickly, would you say that your symptoms today are better or worse than a year ago?
Very hard to say, because it varies. The fatigue is the same. I'm not back at work, not back at my normal work anyway. And I have waves of symptoms, a bit like you described. Some, you know, I had a symptom last week that I hadn't had for 6 months, and then it just lasted for 2 or 3 days, and now it's gone again. So it's just a weird thing. It's all I can say about it. Yeah.
Thank you. And you know, in the last week, I've had 2 friends of mine ring up and say they've been having symptoms now for 3 months and they're pulling their hair out. And, you know, one of them sounded really quite sick. But anyway, that's another issue. What's your second question? Because it's interesting.
My second question, it relates to a presentation a couple of weeks ago on here by Dr. Louise Newson, which was very interesting, which was about the relationship between long COVID and hormone levels, especially in women who were perimenopausal or menopausal. And we know that long COVID is more common in women in the 40 to 60 age group. So Louise was suggesting that, or she had found that HRT could be helpful in alleviating long COVID symptoms in women in this age group, and especially the fatigue aspect. And it seemed very logical. So I've been looking into it since, but I was reminded that HRT also carries increased risks of clotting and stroke, and also sometimes memory loss. And since all of these risks are increased in long COVID anyway, I just thought, should we need to be, do we need to be thinking about those risks when we're looking at HRT for women who've got long COVID?
That's a really important question. Anyone want to have some thoughts about HRT, and, you know, should that be accompanied by some kind of anti-clotting medication like aspirin or clopidogrel or something? Anyone? Oh, Trish, Professor Greenhow from Oxford.
Right, just putting on my GP hat, and I just published a piece in the British Medical Journal a few weeks ago with some colleagues who run long COVID clinics. The first thing to say is that we obviously don't give individual medical advice on here, so we can only talk in general. And there's a big difference between an epidemiological finding that this proportion of people get that outcome and this proportion get that outcome, whether it's getting better or worse, and what's going to happen to one individual. So for any individual with symptoms, the most important thing is go and get fully and properly assessed by your own doctor. And one of the things that your doctor will do, hopefully, is get the full story about what's happened to you and how your illness is going. This is an individual thing, because you may be unusual. You may not reflect what the average does. So that's the first thing. But one of the things that your GP should do, as well as what we call taking the full history and coding on your record that you've got these symptoms, is make sure that it really is a long COVID picture rather than something else that you might have attributed it to long COVID, but actually, for example, that individual might be just hitting the menopause or something like that, and it may not be anything to do with the COVID illness that they had a few months back. So all those things require an individual assessment by your own doctor. Certainly, the people we had on before, and we had a whole session on this, I think, that women's hormones, whether it's menstrual hormones or menopausal hormones, et cetera, they can be thrown haywire by a COVID infection and also in long COVID. But unpacking all that and working out what exactly is the treatment for any particular individual is a matter between you and your doctor.
Lovely. No, I think that's really important. Sheena.
Thanks. So I think the original observations about this possible link between hormones and COVID actually came from the Zoe app, if I'm correct, where they showed that you're about 78% less likely to get severe COVID or sort of long COVID if you were on HRT or you were taking the pill. So this is, I think, where these ideas came about. And I am aware that there are some big clinical trials looking at HRT and COVID. I am trying to prevent long COVID. I amn't aware that we've got any data yet the other way around from trying to treat long COVID with it. But I think some of those studies may have started. And there are also other studies that are looking at the impacts of blood thinners. So I think there was a recent study, I think in Germany, where they used a cocktail of 3 blood thinners, which is quite severe, and kind of platelet inhibitors, and showed that that had an impact. And we really need to unpack that a little bit more and see how, say, individual drugs will work. And that, again, would very, very much need to be done under clinical supervision, because they can have other impacts as well. So again, it's partly this sort of cause for optimism that these sorts of studies are happening, and they're happening across the world, and there's all this data sharing. So I think there are lots of reasons to go on HRT, but I would definitely talk to you, doctor, about it. They're out with COVID.
Is that all right, Louise? Have we answered? I mean, we haven't completely answered your questions, but, you know, we've tried.
Thank you. Yes, you have. You have. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to move on to one asked by Craig Brown, who said on Twitter recently, if we've still got it in a few weeks, some scientists quoted research that suggests ear loop N95 and FFP2 masks are only 30% as effective as those masks that are tied behind the head, which is quite scary, as hardly anyone is wearing a mask these days. So there's no community mitigation to prevent aerosol spread. We discussed that earlier. I'd be very interested in any views on this, as personally it's difficult to fit head tie masks and obtain a good seal compared to the over the ear. So we have the world's leading mask expert in Professor Greenhow here. What do you think about this?
Right. I don't know that particular study, but broadly speaking, it sounds about right on average. But as I've just been talking about, what happens on average might not be what's happening with you, your face, and your mask. The most important thing in relation to masking is whether you're wearing one at all, because you know, any mask is better than no mask, and whether you've got the right size. My husband's got quite a big face, and if I end up putting on one of his, it just doesn't fit me, and you can feel the gaps. So getting the right size mask is important, and then ensuring that it fits closely. Now, you can tell whether it's fitting around, can't you? You can tell whether there's gaps. It's like when you put your underwear on, you can tell whether there's a gap around that. This isn't anything that you need a professional assessment for. Check that it fits you, check that there's no gaps. Now, the FFP2 masks, these respirator masks, they're much better at filtering, but often they've also got that lovely kind of squishy stuff that you can press around and get a really good seal around your face. So if you're wearing one of those, whether or not it's looped around your ears, if it fits around your face, that's the most important thing. It's not whether it's tied at the back or looped, it's whether there's any gaps in it. Now, I'm going to try and share my screen. We did this as a practice beforehand. What can you see there? Can you see a picture there now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is just a standard surgical mask, and you can see where the white arrow's pointed. There's a knot there. So if you're given one of those, for example, if you're visiting someone in hospital or something, you have to put one of these on. There's that little trick that you can sort of pull it tight and hook it, tie the knot, as you can see right next to the mask fabric, and then hook it around your ear. That may get you a better seal. So I'm going to stop sharing that one, and I'm going to give you another picture of this is another way to do it. Here's a picture of someone who's got a surgical mask on, hasn't done that extra knot, but has put an extra mask over the top, a cloth mask over the top. Now, for me, that would be too hot. It wouldn't feel very comfortable. But if it gets you a better seal, that might be worth doing. But my personal recommendation is get the FFP2 mask because it usually fits better, and make sure you're getting the right size.
Anyone else? No. Okay. Oh, look, Helen's putting her one on. Yeah, very nice. Lovely. Right. Just coming back, there was a question actually related to the last discussion from Frank Friedman, who said, any thoughts or evidence on aspirin or clopidogrel, both blood thinning drugs, for long COVID? And he says, do stent patients, that's people who've had heart attacks or angina who've had a stent put in to open up, they're usually put on long-term clopidogrel or low-dose aspirin. Do these patients have different long COVID outcomes? Does anyone know of any studies like that? It's an interesting question. No, we don't know. I'm not sure. Well, I'm sure there'll be someone in the, cardiologist doing this right now. I would imagine it would take a bit of time to sort that out, actually. But nonetheless, that's a very interesting question. Next, Elizabeth Gilmore writes, on nasal vaccines, and I just read yesterday in the paper that the Chinese have come out with a nasal vaccine, which they're starting to test actually on patients at the moment or on people. Is there any progress worldwide? AstraZeneca results were very disappointing. Does anyone know about nasal vaccine? Sheena, great. Professor Cruikshank.
Yes, I just wrote an article in The Conversation on this, which came out this week, so you can read a bit more about it. There is a lot of work happening on what we call mucosal vaccines. So the idea of these is they're trying to trigger the fact that when you have a jab in your arm, what it does is it triggers your systemic immunity. And that isn't as good as kind of providing the kind of guards at your nose and mouth. And that's where you kind of breathe in the virus. So the idea of these mucosal vaccines is that we're going to either inhale or sniff a vaccine, and that's going to provide a kind of guarding, bodyguards, if you like, at our nose and our mouth. And there's been a lot of work trying to develop these, particularly some lovely studies in America that are now at the point where they're trying to get the funding to do this in humans. They've recently published, I think about a week ago, in Science. They have fantastic results in mice. And there's also been studies in other animal models. Now, some data has been released from China on their nasal, well, it's an inhalable vaccine, actually. And that showed that it was working better in terms of durable antibodies than the normal sort of arm vaccine. However, they didn't look to see whether you got those nose and mouth responses, but they did see a more durable response. That has been enough to trigger China to put this vaccine out more widely. And Iran, Russia, and another country are also investing very heavily in this and putting their vaccines out. But as far as I'm aware, they haven't released the data publicly for us to see. So there's a lot of interest in this. And I think one of the reasons maybe that the Oxford results were a little bit disappointing is that it's quite complex formulating these vaccines. You've got to get the right size kind of droplets, and the droplets have got to be able to sort of enable the sort of particles to get into the nose or the upper airways. And so there's a lot of engineering to do, a lot of aerosol science to do. And I think that we've got a lot to do scientifically to keep optimizing those systems. But you can read all about it in my Conversation article if you really want to.
So just type in on your search engine, theconversation.com, and type, well, Cruikshank, nobody can spell. So type in Sheena and nasal, and I'm sure it will come up. And that's actually, I'm going to do that afterwards, because it's really interesting, all this stuff about different. I worked in an immunology lab 30 years ago, believe it or not. And at that time, there was a famous immunologist in America called Barry Bloom, who wrote articles, and he kept trying to persuade people that within about 10 years, all vaccines would just go into a banana, and that they put all the bits of vaccine on a banana and kids would just eat a banana. And I thought, what a fantastic idea. And we've been talking about nasal vaccines for ages, but it is slow technology, but hopefully something will come of this, even if we don't have bananas. Right, we're going to finish. Trontier, I'm going to leave your question, quite complex question about long COVID, till next week. But let's finish with Maggie Brooks. When the MPs in the House of Commons discarded their masks, they were in a closed environment where a lot of huffing, puffing and braying goes on, and a lot of them were elderly, and no open windows. We thought COVID would spread through the place like wildfire, yet you hardly hear of an MP getting it. This works well for the propaganda that the pandemic's over, but it isn't so. There must be a reason for their apparent immunity. Do you think the members of Parliament have free and easy access to antivirals such as Evusheld? Can I just say, I did tweet in March 2020, why the hell had they not closed Parliament down? Because Nadine Dorries went down with COVID on March the 2nd, and they held the budget on March the 11th when they were all screaming there. And of course, a load of them did go down. I mean, in fact, the whole high command went down. Hancock got it, Boris got it, Chris Whitty got it, Dominic Cummings got it. So it spread like wildfire. To be honest, does anyone, Steve, you're our resident political ranter. Have you got any thoughts about whether the MPs are all hiding long COVID, or I don't think we know, do we?
No, we don't know. I mean, we don't have the figures, and therefore I think it's quite difficult to explain a phenomenon when you don't know what the phenomenon is. I certainly think there is a lot of political theatre around COVID, both if you remember at some point, I think it was Rees-Mogg in one of his remarkable statements said, well, because we're all, we're terribly clubbable, we don't spread it to each other. And that's a very dangerous idea to give, because there is a tendency to believe that people who are like us are less likely to infect us. That was believed around AIDS. There's some evidence it's believed around COVID. And actually, the people who are closest to you in many ways are most dangerous because you're most likely to be in intimate contact with them. So I think there are many myths about COVID that have been spread by MPs. The notion that they are a race of super people who don't get infected, I think it is rather problematic. So it either we're just not getting the evidence, they're not telling us, or it has something to do with the nature of the House of Commons, that its physical nature, its size, and so on. But Trish is someone who will be far more able to talk about that than I am.
Does anyone believe the conspiracy theory that they're all handing out Evusheld tablets to all the MPs and not telling us? No conspiracy theorists here? No. Duncan, no? Trish, anything to wrap up with?
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, it's like saying, well, we really don't know whether any of the MPs have fathered a child by someone that they're not actually in the relationship with. That doesn't mean they haven't. I mean, I think just because they're not, it's not on the front pages of the papers that they have got COVID, doesn't, as you say, Anthony, right at the beginning, there was quite a lot of COVID stories coming from Parliament. But the other thing is, the House of Commons has got a very high ceiling. It's quite drafty. It's an old building. So I rather suspect that the virus is fairly well dissipated, but we don't really know, as others have said.
But 500 of them all packed in, Anyway, we better not get on to. Listen, thank you so much. I've learned a lot today. I love these sessions because it enables me to mug up on certain things and hear what people are telling us about various subjects. Next, I'm going to carry over Maggie Brooks's. Oh no, we've done Maggie's. Maston, Trondier, Tim Kirby on antibody testing, Fiona Moore and Anthea Lehman. Sorry we didn't get to your questions, but we will come back to them. And thank you all for sending them in. And that's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you learnt some new things about the subjects we've covered. Thanks as always to the panel members for all their insights, and have a lovely weekend. And we hope to see you next Friday. Bye.